Would you pray with me? O Holy One, Creator Christ, Spirit, all present here, we thank you for your words of life, your words that ask us to live a life like the Christ. So may we have eyes to see, ears to hear, hands to do. In the name of Jesus the Christ we pray. Amen. I must want to sing another song because I brought the hymnal up with me. I really don't need it. We have just two really, really challenging texts, and as I look at these, I thought, what do we do with these today? There's just not only so much there, but so much that is challenging in the way that our ancient writers asked us to do. There have been so many ways that sometimes these texts have actually been misused. And my mind says, do I go there or do I not? So the only way that I'm going to go there, and then I'm not going to, I'm just going to make this confession now, is that I'm going to go there in the way that I don't want you to go there. I'm going to confess this about myself. And what I was thinking about when I read this text about leading others astray, someone mentioned to me that they had heard this story recently on CNN about a doctor who was a medical doctor with a license and degree who was really spreading misinformation about the reality of the science around COVID and what happens. And I thought in my mind, well, first, I thought, I want to know more about this. So I Googled CNN doctor spreading misinformation about COVID, and all of a sudden there was this long list. I was like, oh, this isn't good. But my mind had already gone to this idea that I want there to be a special place in Gehenna for those people. Do you ever do that? Do you see someone who doesn't see or think the way that you think, and you want it to stop first, but then you somehow, if it won't, you want ill in some way. So don't do that. There you go. Sermon done. I also think about the Mark text and the way it began, and this is really where I wanted us to think and put our minds today. And as Corey said, about community, talking about community and how this text, which really feels like very, very drastic, like cutting off hands and feet and tearing out eyes, how is that following Jesus? But we can think about that. We'll pull that in, but I want us to think about where this Mark text begins. John, the disciple, says to him, "Teachers, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." It reminds me of a few years back and an earlier chapter in my own ministry when I was working at the congregation that I came from, but 2 appointments back. So I was there twice, separated by a few years. And my experience in ministry really came out of that work, being hired there first as the pastor for youth and for children and families. And it was in that phase. And this started way back in the middle aughts. And one of my jobs as the youth pastor was to work with our summer program. And this church had a very long history of doing summer enrichment work with children. Now, I started working at this church in 2007. Now, what else happened in the world in around 2007 and 2008? The economy just tanked, right? And all of a sudden, the funding that we used to get from grant sources and community foundations and the like kind of went, oh. And we didn't really have the resources. And we said, how are we going to rethink this? How are we going to be imaginative? And our senior pastor says, this could be a good thing. Just like those of us who are in ministry work now are saying, how is this COVID thing going to be a good thing? Well, this thing that happened around 2008 and 2007, how could that be a good thing? Well, it asks you to think differently and to do things differently. And one of the things that we wanted to do, and I should set the stage just a little bit, that our context was a community in sort of the center city of Indianapolis in a midtown area. We're not downtown. We're not sort of where all the investment had gone to build circles and centers and malls and roads and all these other things, but several blocks from that. The prosperity had not by that time sort of gravitated up or trickled out or whatever description you want to use. I hadn't gotten that far. And so we were in the part of the city that had for decades and decades been disinvested in. And it just struggled to survive. And we had a long history of being what we thought was being a good neighbor in the community, being that place that did all the things that we think we're supposed to do. We had tutoring programs, and we had food pantries and thrift stores and all kinds of other things. The children that were part of our neighborhood were part of the 1975 desegregation busing order, and they were the ones that were sent over an hour away to another suburban school system. And we lived in that environment of this push and pull between those of us who had privilege and means, intersecting with the lives of families whose generations were dealing with the effects of our social disinterest in their lives. And the question for us was, how do we change that? How do we change the odds for everyone? And how do we do it in a way that is not one-directional, that we build relationships, that we use our social capital, that we use the resources that we have to be, as Jesus said, a good neighbor? Because we were a neighbor. We were the neighbor with the biggest house in the neighborhood, and we had a lot of people living there. But for years, we hadn't been very neighborly. We had given our neighbors stuff, but we hadn't built relationships with them. So one of our ways of doing that was to listen to our neighbors. We often did a lot of talking, but we didn't do a lot of listening. And so a task that we had were to build on some practices that would invite us to do that. We started first by trying to listen to each other as a congregation. We had this saying that we used, which is called have conversations and have faith, because we believe that when we talk together, we talk more deeply, not just how are you doing, how's your job going, how's your kids, but about what we care about, something that happened that was deeply meaningful to us, that we would know each other better and we would find some way to act out of that concern. It wasn't too hard on that level, right? It wasn't too hard. We see people, we choose to be part of a community of neighbors for various reasons, very often about some sort of similarities in interest and values and what we care about. The congregation got completely tired of Pastor Mike saying, have conversations and have faith, have conversations and have faith. And they say, if we talk about conversations anymore, but we did. And then another step was to have conversations with our neighbors. And so we said, how can we leverage this desire to have conversations with our neighbors? Our neighbors were right there around us, but they weren't necessarily worshiping with us. We weren't worshiping in a way that was perhaps their worship style. I used a bad word there. Their. And so what we did that year, that it was the second year of my work there with the youth and with the community, I knew absolutely nothing about ministry. And I was just doing what I was told. But what I was encouraged to work with and build was a culture of listening that we invited our young people who were our neighbors around us to be a part of it. And we wrote our grants in new ways, and we said, we're just going to connect with our neighbors, and that's all we're going to do. And they're like, well, what are your metrics about reading? And what are your metrics about math? And how are you going to make sure that they're going to do better on next year's I-STEP test? And we said, well, we made stuff up. We said when we have conversations, those are verbal skills that they have, and then we're going to write in our journals about who we meet as our neighbors, and that will improve their right. And we reformed our way of thinking to fit with what the rest of the community wanted, because we thought that everything was based on education and metrics and all those kinds of things. I got audited that first year that I ran the program. And it was not because of what we wrote, but it was just a luck of the draw. We were supported by a couple of the very large foundations in the work, and somebody said, we want to come in and we want to talk about your program. And years before, we had hundreds of kids working or participating, receiving, and we did the things that programs normally did. We played basketball, and we had a reading time, and we had recreation time, and all those things. And I'm not saying that was a bad thing. It took an army of adults to kind of make that happen, teachers who had their summers off, and who were working, college students, and we were able to, we needed to, this was people's time, we paid them, and we just didn't have that kind of budget anymore. So we said, what can we do with this smaller amount of resources that we have? And so we enlisted the help of 2 neighborhood moms, and we started doing this thing called roving listening. This is a picture of that first group of roving listeners, and actually there are 6 in that picture, and then 2 of our neighborhood moms who were kind of like walking around with us, and some other kids who were just kind of hanging out, who wanted to be a part of it. And we would walk around, and we asked our young people to bring a journal with them or a notebook of some kind, and just stop and talk to their neighbors on their front porch and say, what do you care about? That's all. Roving listening. Now, thinking about sort of what opportunities are offered when things change. This was 2007, 2008. The economy goes, So what do people have when the economy goes, especially if you're in a community that really is sort of at the entry level of the economic picture? You have people without jobs, and you have people who need still to be sociable, because we used to do that on our jobs, whatever they're working. So we had people to talk to, people who'd be out on their front porches. And this was a neighborhood that was built from the early 1900s into the 1920s, where houses were packed together. It had the alleyway behind for the garage, and every house had a front porch. It was ideal for this endeavor. And so this group walked around in clusters of 3 and 4, and in later years, as the program got bigger, 5 and 6, and we had more organization. But we went around roving and listening. We got audited. I forgot that part, right? So the auditor from the foundation comes, and he says, "What are you doing?" And we tried to explain how this is not too long after Robert Putnam has written his book, Bowling Alone, that sort of introduced us all to this idea of social capital. And we said, well, we're trying to leverage social capital, the social capital that's already here inherent in our neighborhood, and the capital of people who come in and are part of our neighborhood by choice, i.e. church members who bring the social capital of their lives. So we go, and we're walking around, and we're gathering social capital, and we're capturing it in our stories about people. And the auditor comes, and he says, "This is really, really different." And so I and Pastor Mike sit down and talk to him about what we're doing, and then he says, okay, so I want to come and I want to go with your young people. And so we pick a home where one of the young people who was one of our rovers, it was Sharita in the black shirt kind of in the right. We went to Sharita's grandmother's house. So we're kind of in this neighborhood at 29th and right there on Fall Creek, and we go up a few blocks and go just a little bit, a block or so east of College, just one of our regular neighborhood. And we go to Sharita's grandmother's house, and there's people hanging around the house, and we have conversations with people, and then we kind of pull Sharita's grandmother into a conversation to talk about what it is that her grandmother cared about. And her grandmother talks about her family and coming up to Indianapolis as a young person and raising her family there and having her children and having her grandchildren around her. And she talks about the different, what the different young people are doing and what her kids are doing who are now adults. And our auditor, I'll just call him Mr. Smith, because that really was his name, stops for a moment and he says, is your son the one that you were just talking about? I'm going to make up a name here. Is it Jim? And she goes, well, yes. And she goes, did he go to such and such a high school? And she goes, well, yes. And all of a sudden he realizes that he knows this guy and that they hung out together, and what's he doing? And all of a sudden all this breaks open. And we continue to have this conversation, and we go back. And Mr. Smith then meets with Pastor Mike and me, and he says, I don't know what you guys are doing, but keep doing it. Keep working on this. This roving thing is still going on now. I'm not a part of it. A church pastor is not a part of it anymore. It is completely run by young people who have kind of come up through this idea of doing roving. The next year we had 20, the next year we had 30, and then we realized that we had some limitations of our capacity to manage all of this, and we said we've got to figure this out. But year after year, we learned some things that you didn't think you learned, and that defied the odds and the expectations of society. One of the things that we always heard was, well, people don't stay in the neighborhood long. It doesn't make any sense to get to know them because they're transient. They move. Wasn't true. What we found was that people crave and need stability in their lives. And people also are often victims to practices of challenge, discrimination around housing, but they want to stay in a community where they are still connected, for their kids to go to that same school that they went to because they started in 1975, and now it is now 2007, and generations are still going to that school because the teachers that they had are the same teachers that their kids have, and they're willing to find some way to make that happen. So they're not moving. They are moving, but they are moving to this block or to this block, and there is a stability even inside the life of that neighborhood. I think about that story for a couple reasons. The Mark text begins with a story about exorcism. Now, exorcism, it's a challenging notion. Exorcisms are all throughout Mark's gospel. Jesus casts out demons, and anything that is some sign of unhealth that Jesus heals is an exorcism in Mark's gospel. So we just need to establish that this really isn't about a literal idea of a demon possession. This is about healing. Exorcism is healing. And what our roving young people were trying to do was to exorcise some of the demons of prejudice and misunderstanding and downright mistruths about their neighbors and their own families. And that was one of the things that we heard every year as we asked them to sort of fill out what their experience was, that I feel better about my community. I feel better about myself. I feel better about the way that I am viewed by not only myself, but by you and by the rest of the world. And I used to say, somebody that whizzes by at 40 miles an hour down Fall Creek Parkway on their way headed downtown will never see that. But if you stop and listen, you will learn something. But this is the other part that made me think about the Mark text. As time went on, and its ideas around community development became more and more prevalent, and these ideas, things called asset-based community development, kind of got practiced in other places. Other people started to do some of the similar things that we were doing. And the kids would say, there's another group roving, and they're doing it wrong. They're wearing the same color t-shirts, but they're not asking about what people's gifts and talents are. They're asking what's wrong with people, and that's not right. Well, on some level, I agreed with them, right? We wanted to unpack what was good about people's lives, not start where we can come in and help you and fix you. But they were roving and they were listening. And I would say to them, yeah, I wish that they would turn this around a little more, but it's good that somebody is doing that. Jesus has the same conversation with the disciples as he is out wandering around Caesarea Philippi. The disciples want Jesus to go around to go along with their tribalism, their idea that only I have the answer. The way that we are doing it is the only way that it will work. And Jesus says, no. Not only that, when you get stuck in only your way of doing things, and that somehow leads someone astray, it is a real problem for Jesus. So much so that he says, cut off your hand, cut off your foot, scratch out your eye. This week, a church member sent me an article that I really loved. He said, I know how much you like inclusion, and I had sent, it was Craig. It's Craig Dobbins, and I had sent an article about financial stuff and churches and stewardship, and he says, I'm going to return the favor. I'm going to send you an article I think you'll like. I think he came out way ahead on the equation because I really like what he sent me was way more interesting than what I sent him. He shared this story that's happening in Berlin, Germany. And this is an ongoing story, but for years there has been a cooperative of people who have said, what would it be like for us as faith communities to work together outside of our own boundaries of faith traditions? And there's this church that's going to be built called the House of One. I don't know, I struggle to even call it a church. This is a model. It hasn't been... It is in the process now, but this is the architect's rendering of it. And a rabbi and an imam and a Protestant Christian pastor work together, and they will occupy and share together one edifice, one building, each with a wing for their own worshiping styles, but a central common community area where the three communities will interact and live and work and eat and to do all those things together. House of One. What does it take to break down those ideas and those boundaries that we have, that we conceive that we are the only ones that have the answer? This week I spent time that I felt like I didn't have being part of a group. I applied to and was accepted into Class 51 of Lafayette, Leadership Lafayette. Leadership Lafayette is a program where there's a number, I think in our class we have 43 folks who come together and we meet monthly and get to know what the things that are happening in the communities, some of the organizations, what they do, how we can know more, how we can be a part, and ultimately, the title is Leadership, how we can lead. And look at the diversity in that group. We have people from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of vocations, all kinds of life experiences, all ages. We have people who are in law enforcement. The sheriff is in our class, one of our West Lafayette police captains. But we have people who are part of nonprofits and small businesses and chambers of commerce. People of faith who come together and say, how can we know more about our community? How can we listen so that we can build community together? It isn't always easy. I was carrying around I made these little quarter sheet cards with the We're Out Day to invite some of our folks to come to We're Out. And I was thrilled. Many folks said, yes, I'd love. But there's one person who said, I don't think so. And it stung a little bit. It hurt. I don't think that person actually connected my personal connection to that, and it doesn't matter if they did or didn't. We aren't always going to agree about everything. But we had to go from being together kind of in this informal time. We went right outside and we had to do this activity right here as a group. And that person who had sort of stepped on my toe, had singed my feeling just a little bit, I had to be one of those people who held these string. Okay, so can you see what's going on here? There's this pipe with strings, and there's 2 strings that come out of every place that it's located, and they're on different places. So everyone has to have just the right amount of tension to lift up a racquetball ball that's on top of this little pipe and stand up and walk together and to move it from one location to another without the ball falling off. And 2 of them have to do it, two team members have to do it with their eyes closed as people with a disability. And then 2 people have to be their eyes and help them. This was not easy. And we all had to work together, and I had to work with that person in my group. Our James text feels a little dualistic, but what it is saying at its heart is that we have to care about each other. If someone is sick, I wish James would change that word to, if the community is sick, we all need to pray. If the community is doing well, we need to celebrate together and sing. When something is going wrong, the leaders of the community need to come around and help figure it out. There will be sickness, there will be hurt, there will be death. And we are called to look and to see what that is. And if we do not see, or if the way that we're seeing it is leading our community astray, Jesus says, pull your eye out because you're not doing your job. I love how our Mark text ends. We think of this salt words by Jesus from Matthew, from the Sermon on the Mount that follows right after the Beatitudes, salt and light on a lampstand, you are the salt of the earth, and we feel pretty good. But Mark placing it right after this really challenging words to the community gives it a whole different, no pun intended, flavor. That we are called to be salted with fire, to be on fire about doing what is right, that builds up the community, that brings in and includes everyone. It is an identity that Jesus calls us to, an identity and a way of discipleship that is challenging, that asks us to let go of some of the things that we have done for so long. And maybe we try and do it in different ways, and different groups will experiment with different things. It took us 2 or 3 tries to sort of figure out the right formula to sort of get that group going and moving together. But But that is the call of Jesus. We call it discipleship. We call it care for one another. And we bring that experience to our lives in the community and in the world. Do we have the courage to see with new eyes, to do things in a different way, to use our hands for good, to use our feet for good, to employ our eyes and our hands and our feet, and to hold up our string and to move our community along with others, no matter who they are, no matter what their background, no matter where they come from? Jesus is telling us that we are all in this together. Amen.